Good morning to everyone, and welcome to the Fall Lecture Series at the College of Law at the University of Saskatchewan, sponsored by the McKercher Law Firm in Saskatchewan. My name is Brent Cotter, and I'm a professor at the College of Law and the chair of the Speakers Committee that has organized a list of distinguished speakers to speak to you on a series of Mondays and occasionally Tuesdays this fall. I wanted to, before Rachel is introduced by our dean, say a few words about the speaker series and highlight for you the presentations that you will be able to tune into or perhaps attend live if that develops for us during the fall season. We're very fortunate, I think, to have the Ariel Sallows chair in human rights law speak first, and I will say no more than to leave to our dean the introduction of Ms. Walker. During this fall season, we will also have a series of 3 presentations focused on the adoption by Canada of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. We will hear from Romeo Saganash a week from today, Monday, September 20th. And following that, on the 4th of October, Professor Brenda Gunn from the University of Manitoba. And following that, a panel to discuss the implications of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, its challenges and its future for us, which will take place on Monday, October the 18th. There will be no presentation on the 11th, which is Thanksgiving Day. Following that, a session and panel focusing on the impact of COVID-19, moderated by Professor Beth Bilson, with speakers attending on that occasion as well. And on November 1st, a presentation by Professor Erica Dick from the University of Saskatchewan and former graduate David Wood, who works in this sector in Calgary on the therapeutic use of psychedelics for all of us to enjoy and experience and be informed about. That's the series of sessions for the fall term. I hope you will tune in, or if it's possible, attend in person. But with no further ado, let's turn it over to Professor and Dean Martin Phillipson to introduce today's guest speaker. Thank you very much, and thanks for attending.
Good afternoon. My name is Martin Phillipson, and I'm the Dean of the College of Law at the University of Saskatchewan. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Treaty 6 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis people. I'm delighted today to welcome you to the first event of the McKercher Series, Speaker Series here at the College of Law. I would like to thank the McKercher firm for their continued generosity and support of this speaker series, which enables us to deliver stimulating, intellectual, and challenging conversations from speakers from the country and around the world. Today's speaker is Rachael Loewen Walker, who is our Ariel F. Sallows Chair in Human Rights Law. The Ariel F. Sallows Chair was the very first endowed chair in human rights law in Canada, created by a generous donation by North Battleford, Saskatchewan lawyer Ariel F. Sallows. Since the inception of the chair, it has hosted many national and internationally renowned speakers and scholars in the area of human rights. And one of the features of the chair is that it also provided opportunities for non-legal scholars to come and work in the university community and in the college community and to share interdisciplinary and collaborative insights into the promotion and the protection of human rights in Canada and beyond. Rachael Loewen Walker is no exception to that. Rachael holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Alberta, and before becoming our Ariel F. Sallows Chair, she was director of OUT Saskatoon from 2013 to 2020. Rachel's focus in her research and scholarship is a distinct interest in opening up spaces for greater collaboration across non-profit, governmental, university, and other spheres. She was recently awarded a Shirk Partnership Development Grant to build a social innovation lab on gender and sexuality, a project which brings students, community organizations, and faculty together to action community-led initiatives aimed at mobilizing social change. Today, Rachael is going to talk to us about the role that our understandings of time play in bringing about social change. And she has a book coming out this November on the same subject. Her book is titled Queer and Deleuzian Temporalities Towards a Living Present, and will be published by Bloomsbury Academic. It is my great pleasure to welcome Rachael Loewen Walker to deliver her lecture.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you, Brent and Martin. And thank you to the team that are behind the scenes for the professional Zoom consultation. I feel like Zoom has gotten fancier as the year has gone on. I had the honor of serving as the first virtual presenter for the McKercher Lecture Series last year, and technology was not so kind to us then, but I know we've learned a thing or two. And so I'm doubly honored to start us off again this year, again, coming to you live from my home office on Treaty 6 territory. My dogs have promised to behave, but they are not usually to be trusted. So we will make it through. So what I'm going to do is share a framing quote for today's discussion. This quote: "We live as time makers. Anything exists as a maker of time." What does it mean to say that we make time, that we live as time makers? Well, somewhat simply, it means that we're part of the movement of time, the stories that we tell about past, present, and future. Our expectations and memories influence what we do, frame what we have done. More complicatedly, the phrase refers to the argument that there is no time outside of these doings and makings that we participate in. There's no grand clock counting our minutes, hours, and days. Time moves with us, and it changes by our hands. Think about the timelines of COVID for a moment, how time has slowed down in the last year and a half. How has it sped up? What do you remember from these strange times? In some ways, the last year and a half has reminded me of being a kid again, when the months dragged on forever, especially the months leading up to Christmas. Waiting an hour for something was excruciating. A year felt like a lifetime. Often my young self couldn't even think back far enough to the previous year, much less comprehend any continuity between the 6-year-old starting first grade and the 7-year-old heading into second. William James believed that children and youth felt time much slower because of the fact that so many upcoming experiences were brand new. Do you remember the first time you rode a bike? Of course, I remember. Do you remember the second, the 10th? Scientists have taken a similar cause, looking at subjective experiences of time relative to the age of the subject. And studies have shown that there is a correlation between age and the perception of time speed. As we age, we do experience time as moving faster. Years start to whip by, and experiences and memories lose their precision upon repetition. This statement resonates with my inability to determine whether I bought my car 2, 3, or 4 years ago, compared to a precise and still agonizing memory of cheating on a spelling test in November of 1992. I was in grade 3. I don't remember each unique event because they blur in relation to the next. And so as we age, our repeated experiences fade. The body habitually moves through the movements. And although we continue to layer skills and memory, understanding and context to these repeated experiences, the events themselves are less clear upon repetition. So during the last year and a half, my experience has been that time has slowed down, returning me to those sensations as a kid, where I waited eagerly for a new event or experience and remember precisely what I did, where I was. I remember exactly what I ate for Christmas dinner this year. I roasted one Cornish hen for my partner and I because I went grocery shopping on Christmas Eve, and it was that or a frozen goose. Not only was the event uncanny, but the Cornish hen at home for two was unlike any dinner I had ever had. I will remember Christmas dinner of 2020. I do not remember 2019, 2018, 2010. This time period has been a grand departure from our habitual timekeeping. It has marked memories and experiences that will never be forgotten. In the ways that communities share a collective imaginary of moments that are out of sync with the mundane and ordinary passage of time. Idle No More is one of these cultural imaginary moments, started by 3 Indigenous women and 1 non-Indigenous ally from Saskatoon, 2012. I'll remember that date. Or the International Women's March on January 21st, 2017. I remember these moments because they changed the timeline. And likewise, COVID-19 has both charged and changed the timeline. So I tell you these curious things about time because they help to demonstrate how we are time makers, and more importantly, how little our lived experiences of time align with any systematic linear pathways. The ticking of a clock, measured hours in a day, 365 days per year. Time is much more subjective than this. But in saying time is subjective, I'm not discrediting the forward movement of time. The fact that what we call history happened in the past, or that the future has yet to occur. Instead, I'm raising a hand at the assumed linearity of each of these moments, because linear time often takes the form of a progress narrative, and in so doing takes our temporal agency away. So progress narratives rely on the belief that our social and political landscapes are moving forward, and in so doing that they are getting better. And likewise, that we are doing better. They rely on the belief that things like discrimination, homophobia, and racism are lessening, or that our quest toward increasing human rights is succeeding. I like to think about progress narratives through the trope of the monomyth, or the hero's journey. And this, I'll just share my screen again here. This might be something familiar. Think about our models of storytelling. Stories follow familiar plot lines. They start with a character and subject development. Oops. Our little character moves through a journey. They move to an inciting action, meet mentors, they face trouble, revelation, transformation, and slowly rise to that climax, that point of learning. Once the major problem is resolved, we tie up our loose ends, we make sense of all conflict, and carry on with a swelling sense of completion. And we know this story. So this is Katniss Everdeen, our swashbuckling hero, lets go of the world that they know, takes a great sacrifice, and leaves her home for District 12, crosses many thresholds of crisis, great challenge, and adversity, and then defeats that adversity in order to return home forever changed. This story arc makes up hundreds of thousands of our Hollywood blockbusters, children's books, even adult books, fiction and nonfiction. It's also the retroactive frame through which we tell stories about ourselves. Both the monomyth and various progress narratives, as we employ them, frame and create the world around us. And in so doing, they actually make time. They make time as a known history, a singular plot line, a goal-oriented trajectory, a path toward greater freedom, agency, and access. And of course, it's no great secret that that specter of progress is a driving force within human rights and social justice movements. We look for futures that remedy wrongs of the past. We want to know better, be treated better, do better. In an article about international human rights law, Catherine McNeely echoes this in writing that human rights are essential means of evaluating the past and present, as well as driving progress for the future. And it's not only human rights movements, the idea is everywhere. The idea of progress is everywhere in discourse, including legal discourse, as Altwicker and Diggleman demonstrate. The model of law as progress is a framing narrative, reinforced through various techniques, such as the dichotomy of old and new, or the movement from classical to modern law. Time, we love to cut time up into distinct eras, and value is given from the movement from one to the next. Another strategy is using language around paradigm shifts. This enables us to tell stories of gradual improvement. This can include a shift from a consensual to a compulsory paradigm where practices and behaviors are assumed but not written, versus those instances where they are mandated. In human rights cases, the compulsory frame implies progression because it enacts a clearer rule of law, clearer direction forward, a clearer journey to completion. Varying philosophical approaches, whether based on practice-dependent or practice-independent values, also align with the linear progress narrative. I borrow these descriptions also from McNeely, who outlines practice-dependent models as those which understand human rights through their political function, or what they are being used to do. human rights in this context are emergent, and the linear timeline at play is that particular rights are the present solution to a past problem. So we can tell this story around the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, which demonstrates this process as it was created in 1948, as the story goes, as a response to the horrors of World War II. International bodies came together to build a commitment to rights for the future. And the 30 articles of the Declaration continue to provide those key building blocks for international human rights and to support a progressive relationship between past, present, and into the future. On the other hand, practice-independent accounts argue that human rights are grounded in humanity. We have rights by virtue of the fact that we are human. And so they rely on protections of personhood, human dignity, agency. There's a more timeless element to practice-independent accounts because they rely on an eternal and enduring truth about the moral center of humankind. They're focused on protecting dignity, moral standing, and so they still enforce a linear timeline as we move steadily toward more and better protection. In all cases, such linguistic techniques are rooted in Western models of language, decision-making, and they also assume the future is predictable, often relying on repetition in order to bring about a future already determined. We know the story of the monomyth so well, we don't even need to hear the ending to assume success. And so returning to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we can recognize the ever-growing sets of treaties, agreements, contracts, and growing human rights organizations as steps in this repeating teleology, while the original declaration stands as is, pure in its original form, an eternal referent back. But of course, the stories are never actually that tidy. Dominique Clement's History of Human Rights in Canada tells the story of how at first Canada wanted very little to do with international human rights. And although Canada was forced to approve the declaration, we joined South Africa, Britain, Australia, and the United States to demand a domestic jurisdiction clause in order to prevent the UN from intervening in domestic affairs. Notably, the province of Ontario was the first to pass a provincial human rights code in 1962, incorporating existing anti-discrimination laws into a single statute, enforced by the Human Rights Commission, the Ontario Human Rights Commission, established in 1961. In the 15 years following, every other province followed suit, repeating a familiar process. The content of the path forward was already determined by the path that came before, writing a future and therefore blending one into another. So what's wrong with the development of human rights organizations? With growth and building and adding new and varied protections? Nothing is wrong with that. These are important developments in social justice, and they have had real impact on our communities. But they do little to contest the model of the grand progress narrative, the myth that if we only had the right protections in place, somehow we would have access to what we needed. Access to safety, freedom, protection. Also, and here's the clincher, progress narratives foster inattentive judgment as they privilege certain voices over others. Just as our experiences of habitual movement render repeated events blurry or dull, the repeated paths of rights lose their impact. So the development of the Ontario Human Rights Commission as the first one in Canada may be noted in the telling of history, but repeated movements disappear from the story. And we see this again and again as the consistent privileging of certain voices blurs the nuance, takes the complexity out of the scenario, and so progress repeats the past with less and less differentiation. Take an example that's closer to home. So in Canada, marriage equality was achieved through Bill C-38, the Civil Marriage Act, legislation which followed on the heels of 8 of 10 provinces and 1 of 3 territories having already passed civil marriage legislation between 2002 and 2005. In most cases, it took a group of local individuals with the courage to bring suit against outdated definitions. Notably in Saskatchewan, Professor Sarah Buhler from the College of Law was co-counsel on the marriage equality challenge in 2004. So as these small victories piled up in various courtrooms across the country, the federal government worked through layers of bureaucracy in order to pass the countrywide bill. Canada became the 4th country in the world to legally recognize marriage equality on July 20th, 2005. And so in this chronological timetelling, the past is that set of archived and stored events that have occurred and been completed. The passing of Bill C-38 constitutes a moment forever emblazoned in the history of queer rights, the moment of emancipation. And so much energy was geared towards that leading up to it. But being aware of our progress narratives, here we have a group fighting for their rights and freedoms, attaining them, and then continuing to live on in a future that has supposedly overcome the past. The past in this narrative is a static, actual event, and the telling of such a past satisfies our addiction to monomythic progress narratives. But the present cannot absolve itself selectively of the past, particularly as it operates within a global imaginary. Marriage equality in this case becomes the yardstick against which national morality is measured, and consequently ends up serving as justification for Western interventions and boycotts of those countries that do not measure up. When we look at Bill C-38 and the institution of marriage itself, this act itself has resulted in trans erasure. As we must remember that Canada still does not provide full health coverage for gender-affirming surgeries in Canada, and provincial services continue to be spotty and inconsistent. So what do we do? Well, just as the novelty, however awful, of COVID-19 has sharpened and stretched the timeline, we can stretch and sharpen our social justice timelines. And in so doing, we can multiply, expand, and diversify the voices and experiences that are part of those timelines. So I'm going to explore 2 different strategies in order to do this. The first possibility is to leap into the unknown future, and the second is to work at enriching the past. So the first of these, to leap into the future. McNeely argues that human rights are out of time. Not that we have run out of time, though our dear Earth would beg to differ on that one, but that social justice, quests for equity, agency, freedom, safety, these movements must, if they are to do anything at all, be out of time as it marches ever progressively forward. What does it mean to be out of time? Well, drawing on feminist philosophers of time, what this is an effort to leap into the future without adequate preparation or recognition in the present. Recognizing that we will have to resist setting agendas for that presumably knowable future, and that this requires us to open up to the new, to possibility, to the unknown. Truly, this shouldn't be such a great leap. Monumental change and transformation rely precisely on the ability to create the new. New ways of being, new ways of relating to one another, new systems and procedures. And yet we are nearly incapable of ushering in those absolutely unknown movements. We're very tied to repeating what has come before, much more comfortable with our monomyths, layering upon existing narratives, systems, and procedures. So how do we do this? Well, it really isn't that easy. I'll tell you a story about what it looks like. In the spring of 2017, I was working at Out Saskatoon, a local community center that supports gender and sexually diverse people. One of the longest running programs of the center is a group called Rainbow Coffee, a queer, trans, and two-spirit youth group that used to provide weekly educational and social programming. At the time, Marjorie Bocage was working with us. And since then, Marjorie has continued to serve as Out Saskatoon's Two-Spirit elder. If anyone knows Marjorie, you know that she does not mince words. So she walked into my office one day and said, "Do you know why kids never want to leave Rainbow Coffee? It's not because of our compelling programming. They have nowhere else to go. They've been kicked out of their homes." I knew this. Even today, in 2021, I know youth get kicked out of their homes for coming out as gay or transgender. But that moment with Marjorie was a tipping point. For some reason, it landed in a different way than all of my existing knowledge, the work, the statistics. It hit both of us differently in that moment. And so we got to work on building what would turn into Pride Home, a 6-room group home for Trudeaus LGBTQ youth between the ages of 16 and 20. It was an unbelievably stressful and incredibly exciting time. But let me tell you about the largest barrier I bumped up against as I started meeting with funders, the Ministry of Social Services, even other queer youth housing agencies. The biggest barrier was this. Well, we don't know how to go about doing that because we have group homes for boys and we have group homes for girls. We don't know what to do with gender diverse kids if we can't divide them up according to our pre-existing categories. In instances where homes were housing trans or non-binary youth at the time, they were relegated to solitary settings, separate and segregated spaces, not dissimilar to what prisons have done with trans inmates, further demonstrating clearly how progress is so often configured according to an existing narrative, rather than imagined through alternative ways of housing queer and trans youth. Maybe through methods that are not at all based on gender. At the time, many providers, those that were wonderfully well-intentioned and those that were not, could not fathom a home with no binary gender division. And that's exactly what was needed. That was precisely the great leap into the unknown. Because just as awful as getting kicked out of one's home after coming out, we knew that Trudeaus LGBTQ youth who were within the social services system were being placed in group homes that didn't align with their lived gender, or others were making the decision for them. And it was firmly entrenched in all policies that no home for youth would include mixed gender occupants. And so from day one for Pride Home, there were no dividing criteria. Gender, sexuality, gender expression, culture, all were welcome. Everyone had their own private room, their own private bathroom, and the rest of the home was theirs to share. By removing this automatic division according to gender, we were able to open up new spaces for connection and understanding. We were able to remove the primary problem of safety and acceptance so youth could begin their journeys elsewhere. And at the time, we didn't have any models or policies to rely on because nothing existed like it. But it was a great leap into the future without adequate recognition in the present. And it meant that we fought to be recognized as a registered home for the first 2 years of operation, having major impacts on stability and finances. But I am happy to say the good news is that as of this coming January, Pride Home will have been in operation for 5 years. And I'm continuing to work with Out Saskatoon to evaluate the model and to find ways to share it widely so that we can open up increased sites of possibility. So efforts to leap into the future or to create and invent models that we have not yet seen is one way of destabilizing progress narratives. But another method is to sever time from progress by fully living, telling, and understanding the past. So this quote, history is inevitably a product of the present and reflects our understanding of the present. The stories that we tell rarely tell us about the actual past. So embedded are they within our understanding of ourselves and our present moment. And what progress narratives aim to do is put distance between the present and the past. They enable us to locate atrocities and discrimination in faraway timelines. By the time we discuss them, we can frame them in such a way as to say, oh my, how shocking to hear such things as homophobia in the present. I thought we were so beyond that. I did this a few minutes ago. When I told the story about Pride Home, I said, even today in 2021, youth get kicked out of their homes for coming out. See, I separated the past and the present, the past from the present there. And I did this on purpose throughout the campaign for Pride Home because it is an effective means of storytelling. It helps me build a monomyth around queer youth experience. It helps me get donors and support. But this distance also enables us to narrate what Kay Lalor calls a civilizational clash. Think about international contexts where we talk about queer rights in relation to differences between the global South and the global North. And the example around marriage equality does exactly this and continues to do exactly this in international contexts. By using a Western yardstick of queer civilization, we deem the global South uncivilized, while the global North is deemed both the civilized present and the way of the future. I use this trope with donors. How can we be so backwards that we would let these awful things happen to youth in our present? I was being strategic, but these narratives are no joke. And Lalor describes the ways in which they operate to back up colonial systems, the lines between civilized and uncivilized, movement from developing to developed world. Now, these workings of neoliberalism honestly can form the content of an entirely additional talk. But I want to share, what I want to do is share some of the ways that this logic operates here in Canada. So on November 28th, 2017, Prime Minister Trudeau delivered an historic apology to the 2S LGBTQ community. He opened by saying, quote, "Mr. Speaker, today we acknowledge an often overlooked part of Canada's history. Today we finally talk about Canada's role in the systemic oppression, criminalization, and violence against the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and two-spirit communities. And it is my hope that in talking about these injustices, vowing to never repeat them, and acting to right these wrongs, we can begin to heal." End quote. Of course, apologies such as these are hugely political, entirely loaded, and in many cases, they attempt to mark a before and an after in the way that the tactic of the civilizational clash can do. There was a great deal of temporal language in that talk. We will work with the academic community and stakeholders to ensure that this history is known and publicly accessible. We must remember, and we will remember, we will honor and memorialize the legacy of those who fought before us in the face of unbearable hatred and danger. And finally, discrimination against LGBTQ2 communities is not a moment in time, but an ongoing, centuries-old campaign. Each of these operated to separate the modern and just present from the unjust past. When I went back and reread the text of this apology a couple days ago, I also experienced a different sort of temporal leap. I couldn't help myself but think about how it took until 2017 to hear an apology, while at the same time reading sentences such as "we were wrong, we are sorry, this will never happen again," both twisted my insides and made me laugh at a promise for a future that cannot exist. But I also have a distinct and unique lived memory of this apology, that of the exact day. I was sitting in the drop-in center at Out Saskatoon with queer people of all ages as it aired live. In particular, the seniors group that met weekly was in attendance, and the room was full of tears. We sat in silence, listening, studying the moment, moving through hundreds of pasts as we anticipated a future to come. In the years since, there truly have been some incredible shifts in our country. These have included a great deal of financial support directed towards queer, trans, and two-spirit organizations. And I tell you these stories because I know that they're not known to the general public. 10 months after that apology, 2S LGBTQ community leaders from every single province and territory met here in Saskatoon to form what would later become the Alchemy Network. Alchemy incorporated in 2020, mere seconds before COVID-19 really closed us down. And so it will also be something I'll never forget. And today, Alchemy is a national network of 2S LGBTQ organizations with more than 160 member agencies in every province and territory across Canada. These members are big queer centers and tiny little trans collectives. They are brand new two-spirit organizations and long-standing queer arts festivals. The Office of the Status of Women has also been revitalized as the Department of Women and Gender Equality and provided a $15 million capacity building fund directly to 2S LGBTQ organizations. This fund has helped many organizations hire their first staff, rent their first building. And we also saw the development of the federal LGBTQ Secretariat, the first internal office focused on ensuring that issues related to gender and sexual diversity are taken into account within policies, programs, and laws, and connecting community organizations with relevant grants and funding opportunities. Again, it's very easy to tell this story as a story of progress, and I often tell it this way: the progress of Canada's queer human rights movement, which includes the role of grassroots communities in pushing the needle forward. But what happens if we let the past slide in to remind us of how close it really is? Because the story of LGBT rights in Canada, of course, pull up my slide here, goes back much further and is much richer than November 28th, 2017. The decriminalization of homosexuality in 1969. In 1971, the first gay rights protest. Who were those 100 people on the streets? 1978, the Immigration Act no longer prohibits homosexual people from immigration. And in 1993, refugees can apply based on sexual orientation. 2005, Bill C-38 and Bill C-16, Canadian Human Rights Act expanded to include gender identity and expression. This is just a snapshot, and of course, even in this telling, it's limited to the voices at the table. Even this is much more streamlined than the movement and chaos of multiple trans, two-spirit, and queer histories, temporalities, and lived experiences. The charge here is to reanimate the past, and in so doing, pull out multiple voices and unique strategies. So let's narrow in on one of these. Let's narrow in on January 31st, 2002, which was the day that the Northwest Territories became the first jurisdiction in Canada to explicitly add gender identity to its human rights legislation as a prohibited grounds of discrimination. It would be 10 years before another jurisdiction would do the same. Manitoba, Nova Scotia, and Ontario all passed this in 2012. So this seems uncannily progressive, as many other provinces had only added sexual orientation as protected grounds in the 90s, and Alberta didn't add sexual orientation until 2009. But the Northwest Territories actually only developed its current Human Rights Act in 2002, following the creation of Nunavut in 1999 from part of its former territory. So this was not an instance of adding gender identity in to existing protections, but leaping into the future by including protections based on gender and sexuality from the outset. They enacted human rights protections based on gender identity at a time that no other province or territory was even thinking about such legislation. And so the past here has potential to make an impact on the present in unique and novel ways. It makes me want to learn about the effects it had. Who was around that table? Do our lived geographies, sexualities, gender identities, and cultures have an impact on the decisions that we make, on the movements that are ahead? Of course they do. Of course they do. There actually isn't a whole lot of documentation online, but I found a small historical note that an organization called Out North, formed in 1997, had something to do with the fact that the Northwest Territories Human Rights Act included gender identity from its very beginnings. Out North was created in response to a call for public input on Northwest Territories family law practices, and then continued to lobby for queer and trans rights in other spheres. So Out North is cited as being responsible for inclusion, and further, a member of Out North was also one of the first commissioners for the Northwest Territories Human Rights Commission. So yes, again, it does matter who is around the table, and what a unique and valuable story about how these things come to play. We only have to dive into one of these historical events in order to reel a whole world of content and nuance. Think about every other one of those stories. Every single one of these stories has a story, has a narrative, has context just like this. And so just as the apology stated that discrimination against LGBTQ2 communities is not a moment in time, but an ongoing centuries-old campaign, this grassroots, complicated social justice work is not a wish for the future. It is happening now. It is a complicated, rich, and diverse, centuries-old campaign. When we stick closely to the idea of progress as additive, as in adding identities to existing treaties and documents, or when we try to tell clean heroes' journeys or monomyths about the brave individuals who fought for change, achieved it, and moved on into a better world, we detach ourselves from the messy, intersectional lived experiences of those who need change the most. This also means that when we streamline our movements so that they are focused on singular issues, we may think that focus brings clarity, but we fail community by blurring out difference. So, a few final words on this front. During the last year and a half, we really haven't had the same stores of memory to draw on. Our repetitions are much more unique than they have been in the past. And the uniqueness means that we have less familiar ground to understand and draw on as we project to the future. Instability like this absolutely leads to anxiety. How can it not? We make plans, they're canceled. We set goals, they're derailed. There's a great chasm around the home where progress used to live, and many are barely holding on. And I acknowledge that, and I'm very sensitive to that. This is not an automatic positive movement. But at the same time, this novelty has made space for different modes of being and doing. And I know many of us are feeling those movements. So let's think about what we might learn as we listen to those places where time has stretched. Where can we reimagine the past in new ways? Where are we reimagining the futures of our jobs and our lives? Because even more crucial to these efforts of rereading is the fact that every layer of retelling also diversifies and expands the present. We start to tell different stories, experience time differently. We are able to destabilize white, colonial, able-bodied histories by telling stories about trans people of color that were always already part of the movement. They are not being added in, they were already there. It enables us to build policies for the future that are truly collaborative and intersectional because they aren't reliant on fighting to add new identities to a model that already exists. And so my case is actually not that queer justice movements have been progress-oriented and that now we need to flip them on their head. It is that they have always been messy, non-linear timelines of new and novel futures. They all are already complex lived experiences. The feminist philosopher Claire Colebrook, I love this quote, has written that any feminist claim in our present is in harmony and dissonance with a choir of past voices. And I extend this to say that any instances of violence, change, justice, or injustice against queer persons in the present, queer, trans, two-spirit, and other people in the present echo a past choir and a future yet to come. And so we can both learn a lot from the work of 2S LGBTQ community organizing in recognizing that social change must always be expansive and novel. In all presents, we deserve better stories, futures that are out of time as we know it, and likewise, new ways of being and relating to one another. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Martin Phillips, and as you saw at the start, I'm the Dean of the College of Law. I just want to say a few words of thanks to Rachael. I can't think of a better way to start off the McKercher Lecture Series this year with one of our endowed chairs to talk about an issue of such importance to us on the campus community and the college community in the city and nationally.
Rachael has been incredibly helpful and supportive within the college in her time as Sallows Chair and working on anti-oppression and anti-racism work with our students and supporting and encouraging our students to take ownership of their community. And I just want to thank her again for that work and also for her presentation and her work as the Sallows Chair, which will continue again this year. And we hope we'll be in person at some point, which would be good. I also want to reiterate my thanks to all the people in the background from Media Productions, Don Warenkin and Shannon, and others, and Shannon Cossette and Shannon Durand, who made sure that we could pull this thing together in an online format very quickly. And again, I also want to express my thanks to the McKercher Law Firm for their continued support of this lecture series and providing us the ability to take important messages and learnings like this out to a wider audience and a wider community. And I also want to thank everybody for showing up online today. So with that, I will bring our first presentation from the McKercher Lecture Series for this academic year to a close. And wish you all the best, and hand it back over to Brent Cotter, Chair of our Speakers Committee, who's going to finish his sandwich and say a few words. Thanks, Brent.
So a thank you to Rachael for a very fine kickoff to our speaker series. Equally on behalf of the Speakers Committee, thanks to McKercher for their generous support to make this possible, and for your fine closing remarks, Dean Phillipson. And to all of you who have joined in, I know we had an excellent virtual attendance during last year's speaker series. And I hope today's presentation will inspire you to sign up on Mondays or to pick up the feed or the streaming of it afterward, after the lectures and presentations have been given over the course of the fall. Once again, thanks for joining us today, and have a pleasant week. All the best to everyone.